Did you know that Asheville is inspired by Don Quixote, Sherlock Holmes, and Hercule Poirot? We first come to know Asheville as Planarcadia's Ashen detective, the private investigator tucked away in a dingy little corner of Delbrook district, who, despite his modest finances and strange social quirks, has more than his share of big-name clients. By the end of patch 4.1, we also learn of his real identity as La Mancha, the famed leader of the Galaxy Rangers who'd seemingly vanished from the cosmic stage. Both identities that he wields, the wandering old vigilante with a heavy past, as well as the oddly cognizant detective deeply involved in Planarcadia's politics, are two sides of the same ideal, the independent crime fighter who commits himself to ending injustice. Whether as a ranger or as an investigator, many aspects of Asheville's character reflect the personalities of some of modern literature's most famous crime fighters. And in this video, I'll be analyzing the specific traits of these characters as they're found in Asheville's story and character. Let's start with Asheville's original identity as La Mancha, leader of the Galaxy Rangers. We know the Galaxy Rangers as ardent dispensers of justice across the cosmos, lone wolves who hunt down the galaxy's villains and put them down for good. You might then expect the leader of the faction to be the most visible poster child of the cause, but Asheville presents a grittier and more jaded view of what being a ranger is. The other rangers we've met, Boothill and Rappa, are driven, energetic fighters whose hunts are often fueled by the injustices they've experienced in the past. In contrast, La Mancha has even more baggage than these two, but is not nearly as active in his ranger duties. A self-described maimed old wolf who's hidden away on Planarcadia and would rather no one even know his real identity. In short, Asheville represents the clash between the Galaxy Rangers' idealism and the harsh reality they face in a world fraught with loss and death. Asheville's real name is an explicit reference to one of the most famous commentaries on this dichotomy. La Mancha is a real-life region in Spain, known for its vast, open plains, but more famously as the homeland of the fictional character Don Quixote de la Mancha from the 17th century Spanish novel of the same name. Don Quixote is one of the most famous novels of all time and is usually considered to be the first modern novel. A quick overview of the plot is an aging, low-ranking hidalgo, a Spanish noble, Alonso Quijano, falls under the delusion that he must become a knight after reading far too many chivalric romances. He takes a new name, Don Quixote de la Mancha, and designates his neighbor, the poor farmer Sancho Panza, as his squire, and thus the duo sets off across Spain, getting into many misadventures along the way. In his folly, Don Quixote sees the world as a knight's tale and thus stirs up trouble wherever he goes. Some of his most memorable encounters include seeing an inn as a castle and being knighted by its owner, charging at windmills believing them to be giants, and battling herds of sheep thinking they were enemy armies. Don Quixote's author, Miguel de Cervantes, wrote the work when Spain was at the tail end of its golden century, a time during which the kingdom was at its height of power and prestige, having established a global colonial empire that funded an era of cultural and political dominance. Spain fought many wars in this period across the world as the bulwark of Catholicism, which provided soldiers ample opportunities to pursue chivalric ideals on the battlefield, which, as a result, were extremely popular across the Spanish Empire. These were the typical tales of a knight-errant, a wandering hero on a quest to defeat some great evil and deliver the common folk from oppression. This is that main ideal of the Galaxy Rangers, of the roaming warrior who takes justice into their own hands by forcefully taking down evildoers. And it's something that Asheville did embody in the past, during his prime. Tucked away in his lore are several references to some of the most famous chivalric tales in literature. One of the out-of-game HoYoLab articles on La Mancha claims that he founded the Galaxy Rangers in an oath of brotherhood with the mighty champions Bear and Owl, and then swore to take the head of the Lord Ravager Zulu. This could reference the Three Musketeers, the 19th century chivalric novel by Alexandre Dumas that centers around the most legendary swordsmen of the Kingdom of France, forming an inseparable bond to take down the realm's villains, be they troublemaking drunkards, countryside bandits, or conspiring nobles of the royal court. Another reference is in Ashveil's character story. Robin Hood is one of his fellow rangers who, alongside others like the musician and the poet, join him around the campfire the night before a big battle. This is, of course, referencing Robin Hood and his band of merry men, the group of outlaws who, in English legend, famously opposed the tyrannical Prince John, taking from the rich to give to the poor, reflecting that same ranger mission to fight evil, even if it puts you outside the law. All this, however, remains the idealist side of chivalry that Don Quixote actually parodies. From the outset, Cervantes wrote his book as satire of the knight stories, to force idealism to confront reality and thus showcasing a far less glamorous, if not even more entertaining outcome. The way he does so is through a mix of humor and melancholy. At its core, Don Quixote is a tragicomic work, ironically reflecting both sides of the elation that Ashveil now finds himself steeped in. Don Quixote, as we've said, is not actually a knight at all, but a severely mentally ill man whose own view of reality clashes with what's actually happening in the real world. Though his intentions are to do good, what he's actually able to accomplish in the grand scheme of things is rather little, as society uncompromisingly punishes his efforts. He gets beaten up and misled throughout the story, breaking ribs and losing not just teeth but also social status as onlookers humiliate him for their own amusement. No matter how hard he insists on being a virtuous upholder of justice, he ends up a broke, lonely laughingstock with only his squire Sancho to keep him company in the world. This is a level of absurdity that Ashveil's current situation parallels. What should be the well-respected leader of the Galaxy Rangers is instead a tired, broken man without a cent to his name, who sleeps in a fridge with a monkey as his sole companion. Racked with survivor's guilt and the affliction of the veracity on his arm, he is deeply scarred both mentally and physically, a testament to how the Galaxy Ranger ideal gets chewed up and spat out by the universe. In Ashveil's own words, a ranger's path is one of
loss, suffering, and vengeance.
Rangers are fleeting shooting stars, flickering lights with short wicks who burn brightest before fading away. The horrors of the world that they face far eclipse any glory earned in battle, and for those rangers that do survive like Ashveil, they're left with lasting trauma. Throughout 4.1, we see Ashveil's flashbacks of the rangers who didn't make it, those fated stars who faced death, regression, or even worse fates that forced Ashveil to put them out of their misery. For Ashveil himself, all that's left of his mission is a final death. His own, since that's what he wants from the Phantasmoon Moon games, but also of one last great evil that he knows he alone can take care of before his departure. This grim realization echoes the end of Don Quixote's adventure too. Having fallen extremely ill and nearing his death, Don Quixote suddenly regains his sanity, once more reclaiming his original identity as Alonso and renouncing the knightly romances that he now hates. He denounces the chivalric ideal as a foolish, perilous path that he never would have walked if he was in his right state of mind, and says that it's only now by dying as Alonso the Good that he can repent for Don Quixote's sins, something that Ashveil embodies as well. Narratively, Ashveil's presentation is also quite similar to Don Quixote's. Most notably is the role played by Mr. N, the narrator, who fulfills a similar role to Sancho, Don Quixote's squire. They both provide the realist, the more grounded foil to Ashveil and Don Quixote, loyal companions who usually compliment their bosses by helping them make sense of the world, but just as often question them or get dragged along in their folly. When Don Quixote is at the peak of his delusions, Sancho often responds with a proverb, hoping to impart some deep, esoteric knowledge on his master. But because of his modest background as an illiterate peasant, he mostly just ends up spurting out some witty, ironic remark. In the same vein, the narrator's eloquent commentary on Ashveil's thoughts sometimes turns into exasperated, comical outbursts, as he's forced to fill in the blanks for the occasionally clueless detective. Another thing to consider is the order in which we learn about either character's real identities. Before Don Quixote the Knight was Alonso the Hidalgo, but for most of the story it's presumed that the Hidalgo is gone with the focus on the Knight. Now, before Ashveil the Detective was La Mancha the Galaxy Ranger, but from our perspective as the Trailblazer, we mostly get to know the detective. It's only near the end of Cervantes' novel in patch 4.1 that either character acknowledges their original identities, meaning we get access to the older, original version of the character after we experience their fake ones. Lastly, Don Quixote was foundational in the use of metafiction as one of its literary devices, which is when a work discusses itself within itself. Don Quixote was split into two parts with a 10-year gap between them, during which fake sequels sprung up as the book made its way across Europe and the Americas. In Part 2, Cervantes actively references Part 1 of the story, but even aspects of the fake books. One example is that when Don Quixote learns in Part 2 that a false sequel had him go to the city of Zaragoza, he deliberately travels to Barcelona instead. He also encounters characters who have read Part 1 of Don Quixote, which shapes their interactions with him, including a duke pranking Sancho with a governorship over a fake island, which was what Don Quixote had initially promised him when they first set off, and Don Quixote scolding a character from one of the imposter works. Now, Starville is a game full of metafiction, even more so in Planarcadia, where characters address the player directly, and we come across works about ourselves and our adventures. Ashveil's case is similar. The Hoyle article I mentioned before is from his own point of view, reading embellished tales about himself that have sprung up given his popularity, exactly like Don Quixote. The only difference between them is that Ashveil actually enjoys the exaggerated stories about him as nostalgic reminders of an ideal once lived and of companions long past. Now, however, he resolutely sticks to his cover story as a detective, a fabricated identity which partially draws on none other than Sherlock Holmes, the most recognizable detective across the world. Sherlock originates from the novels and short stories of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, a British author who wrote Sherlock Holmes for 40 years between 1887 and 1927. Though many adaptations of the character have been made since, I'll be sticking to this original version from Doyle's books for this discussion. The first trait Ashveil takes from Sherlock is his eccentricity. Sherlock Holmes was, by any standard, but especially those of Victorian Britain, a weirdo. A reclusive, drug-addicted loner who disappeared for days on end in his apartment as he obsessed over his cases. He rarely socializes, his living space is untidy, and yet somehow the world takes great interest in him anyway, both within his universe from people throughout Britain and abroad, and from beyond the fourth wall, given his immense popularity to this day. Just about each of these quirks, besides the substance abuse, are shared with Ashveil. His cramped room in the Furbobo office is strewn with papers and boxes, just like Sherlock, and Mr. N outright tells us that there are times Ashveil is dead to the world, stuck in his fridge and only emerging when the monkey, his sole companion, drags him out to do the bare minimum of social interaction and to greet clients. Speaking of Mr. N, he's the direct reference to Dr. Watson as the only friend of the respective detectives, as well as their chroniclers and the narrators of their stories, with Mr. N literally standing for narrator. They are critical to their detectives' success as assistants who actively do research and present leads to chase. Ashveil sheepishly admits as much to Kuchiba during patch 4.1 when he reveals Mr. N is the one to uncover Fulwish's link to the Happy Smiles Society. Ironically, the way each assistant meets their detective is also exactly the same. Rappa, on her quest to track down Dr. Primitive, left Mr. N with Ashveil, presumably making him one of the unfortunate victims of the Slumber Nana virus that, among other things, required him to find new living arrangements. Dr. Watson is introduced to Sherlock through a mutual acquaintance after serving as a military doctor for the British Army in the Second Anglo-Afghan War, during which he suffered a bullet wound. This forced him to return to England and find someone who's willing to rent to him while he recovered. Besides the origin stories of each duo, what's also striking is just how fluid their dynamic is. For Sherlock, there is no man who is better worth having at your side when you are in a tight place than Watson, whilst Ashveil tells us that him and Mr. N are totally in sync and that he really gets him. The two sidekicks, to a degree, share in their partner's mission and solitude. After all, we have no knowledge of any other relative or friend of either the narrator or Watson. Now, Sherlock was not the first popular modern detective, but his success paved the way for detective stories and crime fiction as a genre in general. It's virtually impossible to make a detective character and not, in some shape or form, reference Sherlock's unique deductive style or his way of talking, like, for instance, the word elementary that Ashveil also uses. A large portion of Ashveil's appearance and place in planarcadian society draw from this later, post-Sherlock era, especially his actual outfit, which references Hollywood's film noir genre of crime movies that originated in the 1940s onwards. The name of the genre literally means black in French and makes heavy use of dark, gritty settings with black and white costumes and environments. Male protagonists in these movies often wear, like Ashveil, fedoras, dress shirts, pants, suits, and vests, and typically find themselves in grungy, nighttime alleys or shabby, run-down buildings with neon lights, exactly like Ashveil's base in the middle of Dubbrook district. They're also quite involved with their local communities, making connections on both sides of the law, just like Ashveil's simultaneous bonds with Costide and Paulway, organized criminals, and Kuchiba, a legal officer. Overall, it's an aesthetic that reflects the current stage of Ashveil's life, being bleaker, less hopeful, and less idealistic, in which the more discreet detective role is more appropriate. On that matter, the second character Ashveil draws from in his job as an investigator is Hercule Poirot, the Belgian detective most prominently featured in the works of Agatha Christie, the second best-selling fiction author of all time. Christie wrote crime fiction in the period right after Sherlock's heyday, with a long career between 1920 and 1976, and Hercule Poirot was the frequent star of many of her stories. She viewed Poirot as part of the Sherlockian tradition, meaning they both align in certain aspects, but then Poirot also diverges from Sherlock entirely in ways that more closely align with Ashveil as we meet him. First is their place in their respective societies. Poirot debuts during the First World War as a Belgian refugee, a former policeman, living in Britain due to the ongoing German invasion of his country. This was a very deliberate characterization choice by Christie. Great Britain entered World War I because Belgium was invaded, and the British public was thus sympathetic to Belgians in general. This made Poirot a respected, qualified outsider who became a staple of his new community by solving its cases, with clients ranging from average British citizens all the way to the Prime Minister's office. This is exactly the situation Ashveil is in. Once Galaxy Ranger roaming the stars, he now finds himself solving cases left and right for all segments of planarcadian society, whether that's the local troublemakers in Dubbrook district or the CEO of the planet. Ashveil's physical condition is even more similar to Poirot's as they share many of their afflictions. Not only are they both said to have arthritis, but Ashveil describes himself as maimed and aching with a phantom pain in his prosthetic arm, which matches up with Poirot, who limped badly due to his own past injuries. They both even have animal-handled walking canes, a wolf-handled cane for Ashveil and a swan-headed one in many depictions of Poirot. What Ashveil also takes from Poirot is his code of conduct as a detective, more specifically his attitude towards killing. Poirot was, in his own words, a good Catholic who often invoked le bon Dieu, or the good God, throughout his stories. He viewed killing as not only a major sin, but an extremely corrupting evil, a habit that is dangerously easy to repeat, and he thought that every person had the potential to commit murder. Ashveil, at least as a private investigator, is similarly averse to killing. He's, after all, pretending to be a detective, and the guides he's been reading for the job state that killing is a last resort, with him otherwise preferring to try all other options first. In the Millennium Killer side quest from 4.0, the Trailblazer is given the choice to go apprehend and imagine a murderer with either Ashveil or Sparksy. Sparksy sticks her entire fanbase on the killer, causing them an excruciating death as the body parts they stole from their victims turn on each other. Ashveil, however, is more reserved, deciding to try and arrest them, only turning to violence when the Millennium Killer attacks first. It's really only when the perpetrators are genuinely too far gone that both Ashveil and Poirot decide to kill. Poirot only kills once during his entire career in his final adventure, Curtin. Briefly put, Curtin has an old, sick Poirot track down the mastermind of a chain of killings, someone who's been manipulating others to kill for them. When the perpetrator almost convinces Poirot's own friend Hastings to commit murder, the detective decides to do the unthinkable. Once Poirot figures out who the killer is, he lures him to his room before striking him down and finally ending the chain of deaths with 2 more. The killer's, but also Poirot's own. Having broken his moral code, he decides not to take his medicine and dies from a heart attack. A deliberate acknowledgement that though he had delivered justice, he had also sinned. Now, the same happens in 4.1's story quest. Time and time again, Ashveil tries to reason with the Daybreak Squadron even after they've gotten the happiness surgery. It's really only at the very last moment, once the squadron has hijacked Mecha Pom-Pom and that Ashveil learns they've become murderers, that they've crossed that point of no return, that he responds in kind. Even then, he doesn't view it as an act of good, but rather as an evil that, like Poirot, he alone needed to do. He even offers Cinderborn the chance to avenge his comrades whenever he'd like, showcasing his eye for an eye principle that only through bloodshed can killing truly be compensated. Lastly, Ashveil's inability to truly be free from his duties as La Mancha just generally embodies the contentious relationship between both Sherlock and Poirot and their creators. Both detectives were their authors' star characters. They were vastly popular among their readers, who clamored for more of their stories, which constrained Doyle and Christie. Even if they wanted to write new stories with new characters, they felt forced to write books featuring the detectives, since that's what their audience wanted, the pressure of which festered into the author's resentment for their most iconic characters. Doyle sent Sherlock tumbling down a cliff in his 1893 The Final Problem, intending to kill him off for good, but the public outcry was so bad that he brought Sherlock back 10 years later. As for Poirot, Christie described him as a detestable, bombastic, tiresome, egocentric little creep way back in 1930, even as she continued writing his adventures all the way until her death in 1976. Both authors thus relented to their fans, acknowledging that the character they'd crafted had to live on, whether they liked it or not, for no better reason than
the plot demands it.
This translates to Ashveil himself. Like Doyle and Christie, he too would like to move on from La Mancha, officially retire from the job and, as he reveals to Pearl, die peacefully in his bed. But neither the universe nor his fans will let him. Boothill even traveled to planarcadia specifically to find Ashveil, refusing to buy his cover story that La Mancha simply took off with his retirement money. Ashveil also directly admits that his work's not done, that
Life is just a banana that needs to be kept fresh. And mine can't expire just yet.
in the end, it's too early to tell what will happen with Ashveil. It's still up in the air whether the old wolf succumbs to his wounds, to that gloomier outcome of a sorrowful death that ends his suffering, or if he'll instead bounce back, have some great return to form that restores the Galaxy Rangers, his shooting stars, and become a decisive variable in the cosmos' great game. Restoring hope is, after all, one of the core thematics of the Trailblaze and of Star Rail's story in general, and I can't wait to see how Ashveil's hunt continues. That's all from me. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and comment down below your thoughts. Planarcadia has been such an elating region to talk about, and more Star Rail content is soon to come. Alright, take it easy, and until next time.